Coming up.
I'm sorry.
Has your government decided whether they will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030? Yes or no?
There's been, as the chair of the committee said earlier, I'm not obliged to answer yes or no to those questions.
Why are you so hesitant to just hand over that data? If you won't hand it over to us, who else has seen or used EC Pro? I noticed in the third response it said Navius Consulting used CGE models, but I'm curious, has the data inputs that your modeling is using in CG Pro or GC Pro, has it been peer reviewed by anybody else? You've talked about 300 economists talking about how great the carbon tax is.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Minister, how many megatons of emissions have been directly reduced from your carbon tax since it was introduced? Just a number.
I can give you the numbers. I have the table here. Just a second. Thank you, Chair. So you mean not by 2030, but so far
Directly reduced from the carbon tax.
I have it here. Okay. Megatons, 2018, 5 megatons, 2019, 14 megatons, 2020, 17 megatons, 2021, 18 megatons, 2022, 19 megatons, and 2023, 24 megatons.
So I'm kind of confused, Minister, because out of an order paper question in January, you said the government does not measure the annual amount of emissions that are directly reduced by carbon tax.
I don't have that in front of me, but I believe the question was about tracking individual ministers' movement or individuals in the country, which is not something we do.
It was not. It was what was directly reduced by the carbon tax. So what numbers did you give us there just now?
I don't have that question or answer in front of me, but we published
You just
an annual national...
me some numbers. Where did those numbers come from?
National Inventory Report, which is published annually. It's something we submit to the United Nations. It's a public document.
So they're not the numbers directly from the carbon tax, emissions reduced from the carbon tax. They're numbers that are combined with a bunch of other stuff.
No, the numbers that I gave you are specifically related to carbon pricing. Maybe Associate Deputy Minister Lawrence Hanson would like to add something to that.
Thanks. I partly just making sure you draw the distinction between National Inventory Report numbers, which talk about the amount of emissions in any given year, and versus the projections we do for future years on the basis of the model. And as the minister has indicated, there had been a previous question where we talked about how to attribute individual transportation as something for an emissions reduction, but we can, using our model, determine the extent to which emission projection reduction.
Excuse me, sir. Here I'm asking the minister. So those numbers you gave me, I guess you can forward them to us. They were from the carbon tax. They were the emissions directly reduced from the carbon tax. Yes or no?
The Supreme Court.
Yes or no?
The Supreme Court made it very clear.
Yes or no? I'm asking you a direct question.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Wait a minute. Trying real hard to answer.
I'm curious about the answer as well. So we have to be careful that we don't all speak at the same time because it's not good for the interpreters. And the minister, no witness is obliged to answer yes or no. You can ask for a yes or no answer. But I think this is an important question, and I think it deserves a more complete answer. But so could you go ahead and answer that question? I think your question was, Mr. Mazur, the numbers that the minister cited, you want to know if they're attributable to the price on carbon. That's your question.
The emissions directly reduced by carbon tax.
Okay, so we'll let the minister address that. Yeah.
Absolutely, Mr. President. So number one, the Supreme Court of Canada in its court case on carbon pricing was very clear that the system we put in place is not a tax.
Point of order.
He's not answering the question, and I have another question.
I am. If you're give me 30 seconds. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for 30 seconds to something as complex as carbon pricing. So the numbers that I quoted earlier are emission reduction from carbon pricing. We will be happy to communicate those to the committee.
The answer. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Mason.
How many megatons of emissions were directly reduced from the carbon tax in 2023?
Well, we don't, the numbers for John will correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have the numbers yet for 2023. We're still compiling those. It takes about 2 years, and that's the case for most nations to compile their inventory report. So the inventory report that was put out this year in 2024 was for 2022. The one we will put out next year will be for 2023. We anticipate that obviously could change, but we anticipate that it will be about 24 megatons next year. I mean, we'll have the report next year, but it'll be 2023 numbers.
Has your government decided whether or not it will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030? Yes or no?
The beginning of your question. I'm sorry.
Has your government decided whether they will increase the carbon tax over $170 a ton past 2030? Yes or no?
There's been, as the chair of the committee said earlier, I'm not obliged to answer yes or no to those questions. There's been no such determination made at this point.
You're not obliged, but I think you have a moral duty to answer Canadians.
I have an obligation
But he
to
said
answer. That's exactly what I'm doing. I
there's been
think
no
those
decision. There's been no decision.
an issue and as significant to Canadians as climate change deserve better than a yes and no answer. I guess that's my point.
Yes, they absolutely do. If you're going to go beyond quadrupling the carbon tax, absolutely. Any indication? Do you think you might?
And I'll remind you that it's not a carbon tax. It's a pricing system on carbon.
So the way it's going, do you think it might, or it might not?
I think it's the third time. I'm happy to repeat it again. It's your time, sir. We haven't had any conversations about that.
The Environment Commissioner revealed that your government gave away billions of dollars through their $8 billion net zero accelerator fund without knowing any of the emissions would be reduced. Were you aware of this?
I unfortunately don't have the Environment Commissioner's report in front of me. I was under the impression we were talking about carbon pricing, but I'd be happy to provide a response in writing to this question.
Talking about carbon pricing, talking about a model that was actually potentially going to reduce emissions. And you were having the government we were asking the government whether to prove it or not. So the net accelerator fund was actually from the Commissioner's report, and I'll read it. The majority of the net zero accelerator contribution agreements do not have commitment for emissions reductions. Were you aware of that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this accelerator is under the responsibility of the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. I'm sure they would be happy to provide answer to your question. Again, it's not a question pertaining to carbon pricing.
Does that concern you at all? That the Commissioner found this?
Again,
I'm wondering, instead of outright denying climate change recently, the Conservatives have changed tacks and they're trying to undermine the carbon pricing system, even going as far as to question the modeling, which has now been provided and fully, and I'm not quite sure what we're going to hear back on that. And we know that hundreds of scientists have endorsed not only carbon pricing, but also the model. So it's clear that the only scenario where opposing climate action makes sense is if you don't believe that climate change will have real costs. But the evidence is staring us in the face. So could you share with the committee the consequences of not taking action to address climate change by putting a price on pollution?
As I said earlier, we've entered the era of climate change, and most of us, not all of us in this room, but most of us believe that climate change is a very important issue and one that's deserving of all our attention and all of our efforts. And we've adopted in the last few years unprecedented rate of measures, and we've adopted investments that we've never seen in the history of this country to tackle this very issue. In fact, Canada just received an award from the Climate Scorecard, rating us, giving us a score of 70% for what we've been doing on climate change. So it's not, we're not perfect, and some are ahead of us, but we've certainly come a long way from where we used to be pre-2015. You've spoken about the cost of climate change. We've seen the insured cost of climate change go from an average of $400 million per year in Canada to about $2 billion. The last 2 years were about 50% higher than this $2 billion $2 billion a year of insured costs to Canadians. If I may use a bit of a parallel, a very incredible Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, when faced with a similar challenge, ozone depletion, decided to tackle this head on. Imagine if in 1987, Brian Mulroney would have said, oh, we don't believe in ozone depletion. We're not sure it's caused by a human. We don't really believe in the modeling. It's going to be too expensive to do anything about it. Well, MP Bazan from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman spoke about skin cancer today in before question period and how, what we need to do. If we hadn't tackled ozone depletion, skin cancer in Canada would be through the roof. The cost of the Canadian health system, the incredible cost to Canadians. I would hope that the Conservative Party of Canada could use the same wisdom and foresight in dealing with climate change and say, you know what, this is a really big issue, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to work together to tackle this issue, as they did as a party in 1987 when it came to fighting ozone depletion. And no one talks about ozone depletion. You ask kids who are 20, 25, they've never heard about ozone depletion. Why? Because it's largely being solved. And the ozone layer is doing better, and it should have recovered by 2060. Imagine if the Conservative Party of Canada did that for climate change, where we would be as a country. One can only hope, and one can only dream, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. I just want to go back to some of those numbers you gave earlier and trying to understand how accurate some of the numbers that are, in theory, firm in the National Inventory Report that we're submitting to with our international colleagues. But it is all based on a projection. Is that correct? That when we say we are going to reduce 30% of emission reductions by 2030 will be done via the carbon tax, that is a projection. Not even in the years past that it's been in place, we don't actually currently know how much that has reduced emissions. Is that correct?
That's not correct.
How do you attribute the information then? How do you know with certainty that what percentage of the NIR reporting that you are offering is due to a carbon tax?
So I think there's two things here. The National Inventory Report is an annual exercise where we measure the emission reduction from different sectors of the economy, different provinces, and that's measurement. That there is some there's some modeling, but largely it's based on hard data. We do have to, for example, fugitive emission in the oil and gas sector is harder to measure because they are fugitive emissions by definition. We started using aerial measurement to complement some of the work we've been doing on the inventory. That's one thing. What the answer to your question on what is the role of carbon pricing is not related to the National Inventory Report. It's based on analysis looking at different measures and how much they contribute to emission reduction in Canada.
So I appreciate that. That's the reason that we're here today. We invited you to the committee to discuss exactly that. You've seen, obviously, the three motions that this committee has passed with varying degrees of simplicity in terms of just looking for the variables, the assumptions, and the data included to specific language regarding EC Pro. If you were a member of this committee, not the minister sitting there, would you feel confident and comfortable with the responses your department has given this committee in terms of the production records that we are asking for? Because when I see a document that is a website link, when I see a document that is written by 4 people that don't even work for ECCC and it says draft on it, and it says this is not representative of ECCC or the Government of Canada, and then thirdly, a 3-pager with an attachment of a so-called independent think tank, which turns out is funded by ECCC, do you think that is sufficient, honestly, do you think that's sufficient in terms of what we are looking for? Because I think all of these questions could be answered if you would just hand over the modeling as requested by this committee so that we could better understand how you are coming to these conclusions. Is that not a reasonable request, Minister?
So I'm quite clearly not a climate modeler, although I have in my life worked on a number of occasions with climate modelers. It's a very complex exercise. It's not magic. It's mathematics, and we use modeling in all sectors of our society. We use it in economy, we use it in health, we use it in employment sectors, and we use it in the climate change sector as well. We have provided information, and you have our chief, I don't know if it's your title, Derek, but let's call him for the sake of argument, our chief modeler, with you here today so he can answer your question. This is it is, I'll be the first one to recognize that it is complex. And you want simple answers. I'm sorry. There's no simple answer when it comes to climate change or modeling.
I appreciate that, Minister. And listen, I'm not a climate modeler either. I'm not saying that I'm going to be the one that is going to understand as I believe it was 280,000 formulas and data points that would be included in the model. My point is that people in this country can't outside of ECCC. So my two-part question, I guess. Why are you so hesitant to just hand over that data? If you won't hand it over to us, who else has seen or used EC Pro? I noticed in the third response it said Navius Consulting used CGE models, but I'm curious, has the data inputs that your modeling is using in CG Pro or GC Pro, has it been peer-reviewed by anybody else? You've talked about 300 economists talking about how great the carbon tax is. Have they looked at this analysis? Who has seen this outside of ECCC? And why are you so unwilling to give it over to this committee and let Canadians have a look at the data that you're using to make the assumptions that you are that the carbon tax is actually working?
So the way the modeling community tends to work is that obviously there are different models out there. Let's talk specifically about climate change. There are different models out there. And what the modeling community is trying to do is to work together to ensure that despite the fact that we are using different models, there's not 15 of them out there, but there's some of them, that we understand what are the underlying elements of each of those models so that when different people use different models, we at least can agree in what goes into the models. Which
why can't it be open, though? Why wouldn't you want everybody to see it?
We're out of time, unfortunately.
Shouldn't it be fair for everybody that can understand this stuff to be able to see it?
We're out of time.